Good evening and welcome. We are so glad to have you here this evening on quite a wonderful Saturday here at AIDA Africa, because today we have a panel of co-authors and we have been listening to each other's journeys, and today we listen to a journey of co-authorship. So if any of you had a chance to read the journal article that we shared with you earlier before this webinar, you might be wondering about how did this piece of art come together? It's very much like looking at a piece of art or a building and thinking about all the different things it took to build it. Some of you might have questions on the content, and a few of you might be also quite curious about, the process. So that's why we are here today to talk about both the content and the process of this publication. We'd like to know what was it that this team of co-authors worked on, and how was the process like? So we are very honored today to have Mr. Patrick Mutinda. We have Dr. Fatma Shariff. No, sorry, I got that second name wrong. Professor Alesha Porisky, and obviously the other co-author whose name I'll get in a minute. And I would like to now welcome the co-authors to tell us about their journey. And if any of us have any questions or comments, feel free to post them in the chat, in the Zoom chat. And meanwhile, I'd also like to request all of us to introduce ourselves in the chat. Only because of time, we may not be able to take every person's introduction. My name is Dr. Wangari. I am the lead mentor at AIDA Africa. So now I'd like to invite Patrick to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Wangari. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Great, thank you. Allow me to share my screen, and I'll put off my camera because of the bandwidth and share my screen.
Yeah, all right.
Oh, great. Thanks for sharing the screen. Welcome, everyone. I think you've already been welcomed to this session. My name is Patrick, and my colleague on this work, Alesha, is also with us. Tahira might join us. She's traveling today, unfortunately. But she might join us at some point. So we are happy to present to you our journey to publication, our journey in as far as publication is concerned. Please, you may go to the next slide. So the paper we are talking about is Kenya's Universal Pension Plan, the Universal Social Pension, the Politics of Registration in Marsabit County. And that's the link. The paper had already been shared before, and we will share the link again in the chat. Just a quick outline of what we are going to talk about. So we'll say something briefly about the study and describe how the journey has been since the initial stages until the first manuscript, and how we took into account the comments from the reviewers and publication. Next slide. Just a brief overview. This study was part of a larger study that is done, that was coordinated by the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Center. That's University of Manchester. They do global studies on different issues. mainly touching on development. Next slide. In Kenya, they have focused on social protection, and the study in Kenya has been done in 2 phases. And the study we are presenting to you today was out of the 2nd phase, which ran between 2017 and 2020. And the major research question was really how does variation in state capacity and state-society relations impact the implementation of cash transfers across local levels, subnational cases at the local level. And we will tell you more about the study as we proceed, but at this point, I want to mention that the team that was involved in the 2nd phase of the ACID study was much bigger, but in Marsabit, it was mainly the 3 of us, and after the study, we decided to publish something, and that's the journey we are going to share. Next slide, please. The study, as I told you, was a huge one, and there were 4 counties in Kenya that were selected. For now, don't worry about the numbers. We did some initial mapping. The study, the earlier phases of the study did some mapping of state infrastructural power. For those in political science may understand some of these terms, but for now, the higher the number you see, the higher the number, the higher the infrastructural power. And I'll at some point call in my colleague, and she may clarify some of these things. But basically, there was Homa Bay, Nakuru, Nyeri, and Marsabit, and our paper is based on Marsabit County. Next slide. So for many of you, this might be a new thing. Social protection and the cash transfer stuff might be new to you, but just for you to know, in Kenya, there are 4 main groupings of cash transfer programs, all lying under what we call the National Safety Net Program, or Inua Jamii. And so there is the cash transfer for the orphans and vulnerable children. That's the cell, the part of the table top left. And then top right, we have the older persons cash transfer program, which was the precursor to the Inua Jamii social pension. And this one focused on those aged 70 years and above. And then we have the others, for those with living with disabilities, and the Hunger Safety Net program, which focuses on the northern counties, the northern marginalized counties. We have Turkana, Marsabit, I think Garissa, and there is a 4th one. So our focus was really on the elderly cash transfer program, older person OPCT, and the social pension, which really, the social pension was really a transformation of the OPCT. And that was what we focused on. Next slide, please. So just some info on this program. And for those who are from Kenya, the popular name is really Pesa ya Wazee, which means money for the elderly. And as I just said, it was a transformation of the OPCT, Older Persons Cash Transfer Program, whose age cutoff was lower. It focused on those 65 years, aged 65 years and above. but the universal pension raised the bar, the age limit. And it was started in March 2017. And for those from Kenya or the region, we know 2017 was the election year, and we are going to say something about it. Every beneficiary gets 2,000 Kenya shillings per month. And there was the process of registration from July 2017. And as I said, those who are eligible are those aged 70 years and above. And yeah, that was basically those aged 70 years above. Next slide. Something small about the implementation structure. We have the structure running from the national level, county level, sub-county level, and the location level. For this slide, I just want to focus on the location level, of course, national level and location level. But as you will see from our argument in the paper, we found out that the center, which is the national level, was not holding. There was not proper control of the implementation. And we were focusing on registration of the beneficiaries. So we ended up having people at the location level controlling the process, somehow deviating from what the national government guidelines were saying should happen on the ground. Next slide. So that's the map of Marsabit County on the top right, on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And we used the framework that, we based our paper on the state infrastructural power. And this is the capacity of the state to actually penetrate civil society and implement political decisions on the ground. Put in simple terms, really, it's the presence of the government on the ground. And you may know that Marsabit, Turkana, and most of the northern counties have really been historically marginalized. So even the physical infrastructure has been a problem until, of course, recently we've seen huge improvements of, especially like in the Marsabit area, we see the road from Isiolo through Marsabit to Moyale. Turkana now we can see the road from Lodwar, Kakuma, Lokichogio to Juba, South Sudan, opening up stuff, but it's not always been like that. And even with this improvement in road infrastructure, there is still a lot to be done. And infrastructure, of course, goes beyond road network. There are other factors that we consider. How is the government providing finances to its offices down there? How about the personnel? Do officers down there have enough resources, computers and the like, to carry some of these national directives? So, and then the oversight part. How is the oversight done here? So do we have close supervision of the officers implementing these programs? And how do people view the government, people there? I think you've heard from some parts of this country, including Marsabit, that when you come from Nairobi, you've come from Kenya. They don't consider themselves part of Kenya. So how does the state relate with the people down there? So these are the things that constitute state infrastructural power. And as you see in the next slide, let's proceed, next slide. Maybe it will be there two slides later. So you will find that this had a huge impact on the implementation. And so this was a qualitative study, and we conducted it in 2018, between April and July. And we did 32 interviews, semi-structured interviews, and 10 focus group discussions with varied groups of government officials, village leaders, politicians, and the committees involved in the implementation of this program. Next slide. And this is the point I was trying to make earlier, that we found out that contrary to what the national guidelines provide, the program was implemented very differently from what it was supposed to be implemented. It was supposed to be a universal pension where everyone is sort of registered, but this did not happen. And there were a lot of local dynamics, which meant that not everyone was supposed to be registered was registered, and those who are registered were not registered the way they were supposed to be registered. And this was caused by weak infrastructural capacity and pressure from the national government. If you remember, for those who are in Kenya at that time or who follow news on Kenya, this was a huge pledge for the then Jubilee government, which was seeking a second term in office. And you and I know that most people who vote are the elderly people. So when you promise something to the elderly people, they will most likely vote for you. And this is what happened. The timing of this intervention was really the catch. And we had, right now we'll not be able to share all the evidence, but people really confessed to us that they voted for the government then because they had been promised cash transfer, pesa ya wazee, money for the elderly, and that's why they voted for Jubilee government. But now we're asking ourselves, is this the right approach, really? And we found that this had its impacts, and the program was not implemented the way it was supposed to be implemented. Next slide. So when you follow the link, you'll be able to find our paper. The main aim of this session today was really to share our journey, and partly, if any questions come on content, we would take them on, but the main focus was really to share the journey, because many people have tried to publish, but it's not been possible. We just thought of sharing our experience, and if this can inspire anyone out there, that will be great. And the slide you are seeing right now simply summarizes what I've just explained. And we invite you to read our paper to get into really some of the insights that we found out. Next slide. So I'll do this as the final slide, and then I'll invite my colleague to take from here. And it's really describing our journey, how it has been done. I know some of you actually have reached out to me on how they can publish, how they can submit that manuscript. And we hope this one will be of help, but also happy to provide more information after this. So we, as I've explained, we started with this research project, the research project by the University of Manchester, the ACID Research Center that we did. And the first thing that we did was to do a report for Kenya. But after that, because my colleague Tahira and I, and of course Alesha, we had interests in research, like taking it further to publish. We thought of publishing something on Marsabit. So we put together a paper that was later published as a working paper by the research center. And this working paper was published in January 2021. Of course, we did some edits, but we've not focused on that in this presentation. We did some reviews, we submitted, and then we were told there were some review comments and we acted on them. I can't remember the number of times we reviewed it, but there was that. And so for anyone wishing to publish, you may consider following this approach where you first publish as a working paper, because in that you already get initial comments that would make your paper better for potential publication in an academic journal. And really, the working paper was really useful for us because it made our paper better. And then after the working paper was published, it was shared online, it caught the eyes of the World Bank. So there is the let me call it a department, for lack of a better word, in the World Bank called Social Protection and Jobs. But we call them global practices. So they usually take stock of what's happening in the field, and they noticed our paper and they invited us to a seminar where we presented our paper, and we were able to get immensely useful comments from the staff of the World Bank, the Social Protection and Jobs global practice. I think we have some noise, Wangari.
Sorry, you may proceed.
All right, thanks. So in short, the working paper and the presentation at the World Bank seminar were quite critical in making our paper better. In all these instances, we were able to, as you can see, after the paper was published, the working paper was published in January, the World Bank team reached out to us, and 2 months later, we presented in March at the World Bank seminar. And then we now started thinking about really publishing in an academic journal. And we chose, I don't know whether, for those who have looked at the paper, you will see that we've published in the World Development Journal. And our choice of the journal was really based on the reputation. So we have, the Journal of World Development publishes a lot of stuff on like development studies generally, social science stuff. And we thought that would be a really good place to place our paper. And but of course, the review process is quite intense. And we decided to take up the challenge. And then what we did was to divide up the work. So we had the working paper, and we also had the wider research report for Kenya from this study. And we had to sit down and do some planning so that we sort of share the work and know who is handling what. So if you go to page 13 of our paper, you'll be able to see who contributed on what. But basically, everyone did like a huge part of the paper. We had the conceptualization part. We also had, I think the screen disappeared.
Sorry, I was trying to get the page 13 in case some people
Yes,
have joined and did not have the link. Is that okay?
yes, please.
Okay, let me try get it. Yeah, okay.
So if you are thinking of doing a publication as a team, that's really critical that you agree on who is taking on what. And that way, I think it will be easier for you. But if you just approach it without any plan, I feel like it would be a difficult thing. So as you can see in the slide that's showing now, we divided up the work that way, and everyone at least did data analysis and writing. And yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to show. We may revert back to the other slide. And co-authoring in a team is also important for those who are starting, because I mean, research is not easy, and research writing is not easy. And people don't get really to be told this. It's not easy, but again, it's not impossible. So if you start in a team and it's a good team, then you'll be able to do something and achieve something. I really have to commend the team that that we were working together on this. The level of collaboration was just on another level, but that does not mean really that we were not busy. There was a time I had 2 jobs and I was studying my master's. Alesha had been teaching and having some projects. I think Tahira was also doing a PhD and doing other things. So it was really not, it's not that we had the time. We did not have the time. And as you will see, there are many times we had to ask for extension, request for extensions. But being in a team, which was really efficient, made this possible. Are we still having the slide?
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry. I thought I was sharing screen. Okay. Can you see now?
Yes, if you could maximize that. Go to the previous slide.
Okay. I go to the next slide?
No, here.
Yeah.
So the point I was making is the need to divide up the work properly. The other factor that influenced how we shared the work was really what components of research one handled. As you saw, this was a big project, and I was mainly working on the cash transfer program for the orphans and children, but I also did some interviews with the elderly people. So I did, for this paper, I did the minimal work in terms of the actual research, because I was mainly focusing on the cash transfer program for children and orphans. My colleague Tahira was focusing mainly on the elderly cash transfer program, but also did some interviews for the cash transfer program for the children. So that was the logic behind this. So Tahira and I were mainly in the field, and then we had the supervision of Alesha was the principal investigator for this one, but was quite helpful in the conceptualization and sort of guiding here and there, but our contribution was really, I would say, everyone did really good work in whatever they were doing. So at this point, and so we were able to submit the first manuscript in December of 2020, and it just came out. So those were like 2 years of peer review. And now at this point, I would like to invite my colleague Alesha to take us through the next steps.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick. Really appreciate that presentation. I'm going to take us through a little bit of that publishing process and what that looked like for us, including the different rounds of revision. So as Patrick mentioned, we first submitted this article to World Development in December 2020. So this was a 2-year process. I would say that's slightly abnormal, the length of the process, but it does kind of bear that publishing is this really long process. So to have kind of a year, for example, in between your first submission and something coming out is not abnormal. So really considering that length of time is important. So the first, rounds of revisions that we got back included comments from the editor as well as 2 reviewers. The editor's comments were more general things that they, I think, provide to most authors who are publishing in that journal. So removing as much as possible references to the gray literature. So this means sources that aren't peer reviewed, to engage more with the interdisciplinary literature. And this is in part because World Development is an interdisciplinary journal. So for them, they wanted to make sure that we were engaging with work from economics and other places that, other disciplines that touched on social protection, and to ensure that the work that we are engaging with is representative of, scholars in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, and professional standing. The 2 reviewers had a number of comments, and the comments at this point were really quite lengthy, but we kind of took those comments and realized that there were a number in common that we needed to address. So the reviewer comments focused on strengthening the connections between the framework. So as Patrick had presented, this idea of state infrastructural power and our analysis of the ways in which state infrastructural power actually impacted the registration process of the universal pension. They also asked that we further embed our discussion in existing policy frameworks, including frameworks within Kenya, but also globally. They also asked that we expand the quotes that we used in our analysis to better ground our findings. So this required us kind of going back to those interviews, and Tahira and Patrick did a fantastic job of pulling out additional quotes from those interviews to help ensure that the arguments we were making were well supported by our data. And finally, they asked us to expand our conclusion to include a stronger discussion in the conclusion of the policy implications of the research, to compare findings to other countries in the region, so other universal pensions, social pensions that were being implemented. So we do that in particular in the paper through kind of comparison with Tanzania's social pension and some of the challenges and successes that they had with registration, and expanded also on areas for future research, because as we note in the paper, this really is an examination, of a particular program, of a particular county, and a particular point in time. And so there's certainly room for future research, for further research, even on, the social pension, which has changed considerably since we were studying it in 2018. Reviewer number 2 also had a number of minor revisions for us to address, which were very useful. So these were kind of minor things ranging from spelling errors to kind of the use of certain terms, which they had other suggestions for. And so, as Patrick had mentioned, we were all very busy at this point. And so we'd actually asked when we got those revisions back for an extension at some point. So the journal will come back to you and say, okay, you have these revisions. We'd like to see that you return it within a certain time frame. It's usually a few weeks to a month. And then we requested to the journal that we actually have some additional time, just given the pressures that we were currently facing, both personally as well as professionally. And so then the second round of revisions came back, and that was actually a really lengthy time. I think that is quite abnormal. One of the reviewers took a very long time to return their comments at this point, and we actually had to follow up with the editors to see if they could reach out to the reviewer. But we eventually did get comments back in March 2022, and we were able to turn this round pretty quickly and return the manuscript in April 2022, a month later. The editors had the same generalized comments, and we indicated the ways in which we had addressed those comments. And reviewer number 1 and reviewer number 2 had some additional comments each. So reviewer number 1 noted, comments about further streamlining, as well as the theoretical framework chosen. And in particular here, they noted that the focus on state infrastructural power, the way in which we had presented it, was very much in this top-down manner, focusing on the way in which the government interacted and kind of imposed state infrastructural power, rather than also examining those state-society relations. So this is something that we really changed and strengthened throughout the paper to say there are absolutely ways in which these bottom-up dynamics matter for the implementation of these policies. And so we made significant changes to actually emphasize that within the final paper, and really ensured, that we able to draw on other data to highlight the ways in which local dynamics, particularly in terms of, the role of clan elders, played into implementation. And they also had comments in terms of presentation, in terms of the text being long-winded, something that reviewer 2 also brought up in terms of the introduction. So we really went back and kind of took apart the paper in ways and put it back together so that it was more streamlined, that reduced any repetition. And so if we were to show you kind of, or even if you go to that working paper that we published with the University of Manchester, you see significant differences from that working paper that we started with and the final product that was published in World Development. And it was largely because of these reviewer comments that we were able to kind of take it back, take it apart and put it back together in a way that I think made it significantly stronger. So reviewer number 2 had a number of small comments at this point, including, changing elderly to older adults, which was helpful to make sure that the aims of the paper were clear, and to clarify certain aspects of the method. But they also had other suggestions. So for example, we had taken some of the data from Erie County that was part of the broader project as a point of comparison. Now we'd integrated it initially into the initial parts of the paper when we were talking about research design, when we were talking about the universal pension. And the reviewer rightly pointed out that these actually felt like results. So we actually moved this to the discussion when we were talking about comparisons with other programs and other counties in Kenya. So again, all of these comments really strengthened the paper and made the analysis much more cohesive. They also asked that we clarify certain aspects of the finding, including the primary data used, compare more between respondent groups, include language that made it clear about the frequency in which respondents were actually raising issues. And this is really important with qualitative data, where it becomes important for us to be able to say as researchers that the quotes we're choosing are representative of our entire pool of research respondents, or they're representative of a certain group of our research respondents, and that we're not just picking and choosing quotes, but that we're choosing quotes that are representative of the general sentiments raised by interview respondents. And if you could move to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. And so this led us to our third and thankfully final round of revisions. which were received in July 2022, and we returned them in September 22 after asking for a small extension. Reviewer number 2 at this point was happy with the ways in which we'd addressed their comments, but reviewer number 1 still had a few comments for us. And at this point, there were some changes we felt they wanted to see, and which really involved bringing in a greater discussion of broader policies, including the policy discussions of international actors such as the ILO and UNICEF, which they felt would really help move the discussion from the case study of some counties in Kenya to the study that would generate broader insights. And this is an excellent comment. However, we did have to find this balance, right? We wanted to make sure that, the part of our discussion that is really interesting, that we had this data from the certain point of time in Kenya from the initial registration of the universal pension, was still represented. And because journal articles have a limited number of words that you can actually have, we had to make trade-offs, right? We could include a longer discussion of these policy discussions, but that would be at the trade-off of potentially minimizing some of our discussion of this particular case. And given our original data, we thought that was really important to highlight. So one of the things I want to highlight here is in responding, to reviewer comments, you really want to think you still have to be true to your research and your data, but you have to defend your decisions, right? So in our letter back to the editors and reviewers, we said, absolutely, this is a great point to raise. In the introduction and conclusion, we've actually expanded our discussion of policies and of policies both in Kenya and internationally, and rooted our analysis within these broader policy discussions, but we still have kept this focus on state infrastructural power. We still, made sure that we're presenting findings from this particular case because it does have implications for broader case studies within the region as well as globally. But we did take seriously, the concerns that reviewer 1 still had. And so, yeah, thank you so much. This brings us to kind of the publication process as well as responding, notes I want to say about responding to reviewer comments. And one of the things here is that the letters to the editors and reviewers are often very long. So this I've taken, just an example of one comment we're responding to. We'll see that it's actually significant, that you're going to show that to the editors and to the reviewers that you've taken seriously their suggestion, and then you're going to show how you've taken that suggestion into account when revising the paper, and show them on these pages, 45 to 46, we've on page 43, here's what we've done to actually increase, in this case, the discussion of state infrastructural power. And so there's a need to respond in detail to each comment from the reviewers. So our letters back to the editors and reviewers in each case was between 6 to 10 pages long each time. And so there's a need to address each of those changes. And so once we'd returned those comments in September 2022, what we actually saw was that the publication timelines were pretty quick. So it took a while for, again, reviewer 2 to respond to the editors. And at this point, they felt confident that we'd addressed all of their concerns. And we received kind of notification in December 2022, late December, so over 2 years after. And maybe we can move to the next slide as well. Oh, this is just another, here is just another example of the response. So we can see that it was accepted December 17th, 2022. So this is over 2 years after we initially submitted the journal. It was online, so the publication timeline was then really quick. It was online by January 2023, and then it'll be published in the physical copy of the journal in April 2023. And so these are really long timelines, and I just want to concur here with Patrick that it was really useful to be working as a team. I think we all kind of had different strengths and different backgrounds that we brought to the project. But I must commend, Patrick and Tahira, because they really took the initiative and said, yes, we want to work on this working paper. We want to work on putting this out into a journal, and really stuck through it with really long timelines. So we actually had started this before Tahira started her PhD, and she just graduated with her PhD from the University of Sussex. So in the time that it took for this article to come out in the journal, Tahira was able to get her PhD, which is fantastic. But it really means sticking with these long timelines. Oh, yes, and this is a picture of us just before COVID in March 2020, in Nairobi, working on a plan for revisions on the paper, which is a fantastic place to end. And maybe we can, I know we have 15 minutes left, so it'd be great to just open it up to questions. And maybe I can just start, because I've seen a lot of questions about working papers. In the comments. So I know Patrick just helpfully addressed. So a working paper, often you'll see that certain research centers at universities might have working paper series. So we were lucky to be able, because this project, the broader project was, funded through and organized through the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Center at the University of Manchester. They had a working paper series. So we already had an outlet where we could get comments. It was a peer-reviewed working paper process. We could get comments on the working paper and a place to kind of put that working paper out. But working papers, unlike peer-reviewed publications in journals, mean that you can get that comment, that opportunity for collaboration to get a paper out, but you can still publish it in a journal. So it's a useful way to get feedback on a working paper now, or on a paper that's kind of in progress. Right. And it won't always be the case that you're going to have access to that kind of working paper series, but there's many other ways to get feedback, before you submit to a journal. This can be, asking colleagues in your department, if you're a PhD student, to read your working paper. It can be, asking just a friend who works in the same area as you to give comments. And this is often what, I do for other papers I'm submitting to journal, is kind of create this avenue for exchange between colleagues, where I'll read your paper and give comments, and someone else will also do the same. So the difference there between the working paper and the research article is really that the working paper is this work in progress, and the research article, the journal article, is going to be, hopefully published in a peer-reviewed journal, and that's your kind of final product. In terms of, where can one submit a working paper, it really kind of depends. Sometimes there's ones, through various universities or research centers that you might be affiliated with. There's a kind of number ones out there. I will also put a link. I'm part of the African Politics Conference Group, which is part of the American Political Science Association. For those of you who are in political science, this can potentially be a great way to get feedback. We run an online colloquium series. I'll put the links in the chat, where you can submit one of your working papers for consideration, get feedback from two kind of senior scholars in the field on a work in progress, and then you can take those comments and implement them. So I'll put that information in the chat as well. And I'll, stop there so we have time for other questions.
Thank you so much. I see Patrick already took some questions in the chat as well. So we still have a few more minutes to the top of the hour. So Patrick, would you like to take some questions? Is Dr. Tahira here?
She is not, but we will pass on your congratulations, because it's a huge accomplishment.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And congrats to her for attaining her doctorate in the midst of quite a rigorous process.
Yeah, so she thought you would be able to join us. I think she's traveling today from the UK or something, but we hope we've represented her well. I think of the questions I can see. So there's a question on the funding. The project was really funded from the, as part of the wider project, which was being done not only in Kenya, it was actually being done in the region. There was a study in Rwanda, Ethiopia. So maybe Alesha can provide more details, but it was a grant from as part of a bigger project. And yeah, I've also, I think, tried to, it seems like, unless there's a question I'm not finding, looks like we've addressed.
There's so many questions in the chat and quite good interest. Yes, Dr. Alesha, you may.
So, I mean, I always think there's a couple things on that. So absolutely, we were lucky to have funding through the University of Manchester and the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Center, and they were funded through a DFID, or I know they've changed name, but at that point, a DFID grant through the UK government. And it was part of, as Patrick presented, this broader research in many countries on social protection. We met because I was coordinating that research on social protection in Kenya. Patrick and Tahira were part of a team of 8 researchers that I hired to help with that research, and have become great friends and colleagues and collaborators, since that point, and we've been working on this project. So even after, one of the things about the publication process is that, even after that project had wrapped up in terms of the data collection, the publication process is a long one. The other question that I saw, there's one about the Kenyan government, and I would love to answer that one in a second. The other was Daniel had asked if there are specific steps one has to go through to contact the journals. One thing that I did want to highlight here is, so we did not, pay for the publication of this. And I think there are a number of predatory journals out there. So if journals ask you to pay, please know that there are journals out there that will not ask you to pay, right? And World Development, others are, there's many journals. You can pay if you have the funding for open access, right? But this is the only time during the process where and this is something that you opt in to do if you have funding to do so. Unfortunately, we didn't have the funding to opt for open access, but otherwise we did not pay anything. So please be careful about predatory journals. There's a number of really fantastic journals that you can take your work to, and you can go to their websites, right? So, if you Google World Development, you'll get the World Development Journal's website, and there'll be guidelines for submission to that journal that you can read through, and ways to submit your work to that journal. And every journal will have that. So predatory journals are going to ask you to pay, right? They're there to kind of make money rather than actually disseminate your fantastic research. So you want to be careful that, the journals that you're publishing in, right? There's going to be journals, and wide ranging, from in the top of the field to these kind of more middle tier journals. And it depends kind of on your research and where you want to present it. But there's a ton of fantastic journals out there that won't ask you, for money throughout the process. The other question was about disseminating work to the Kenyan government. I think this is a really fantastic question. Paul, thank you so much for raising it. So there's a couple of ways. So one, we did a presentation at the kind of end of our data collection at the British Institute in Eastern Africa in Nairobi. At the end of our data collection, and we did invite officials from the government to attend that. The other way is that we continually share the research, and have not yet done so, but will do so with people that I've interviewed in social protection in the government in Kenya. Obviously, we can only share that, we can only disseminate to government officials, and it's up to them, what they might do with that research. But I do very much believe in sharing research, not only with government officials who were interviewed as part of the research, who work on social protection, but also ideally with the communities where we conducted research, which is something we're kind of still in conversation with and got put on hold because of COVID. Yeah.
Just to add something, one of you had asked me bilaterally how like how they could approach publishing. And like, of course, we've addressed some of the things, but I also wanted to add that it's very important to go to the journal that you want to publish with and download the guidelines for authors. They always have, like every journal have guidelines to authors. So when you go and download that, you'll be able to see the kind of structure that they require and also sort of other requirements. So I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that's a really excellent point, Patrick. And I think one of the key things is to make sure that you're submitting your work to the appropriate journal, right? So that, and what I mean by this is that they've published research, that is similar to yours, right? That you're speaking to the right audience by publishing in that journal. And one of the ways to tell this is by reading previous articles. Of course, I understand completely that one of the issues here can be access, right? And so I highly recommend, if you do not have access through your institution to an article, please email the authors. They will, 9 times out of 10 happily send you a copy of that article free of charge. So if you do not have access, just simply email the author of that article and they will email it to you.
Wow, what an amazing session this was. I guess my question to you, the corresponding author, I believe you are Alesha as the first author, the process of compiling the team's efforts at responding to all of the editors and reviewers' comments must have been arduous. Which collaboration tools did you use? Were you working virtually or always physically? And also, how did you manage to defend when you needed to maybe reject some of the comments and be polite, but obviously not be a doormat,
Yeah.
You do the acceptance and rejection of comments. What language and messaging do you put across that conveys respect and professionalism and politeness?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Wangari. I think that's a fantastic question. I think one of the things to remember here, because sometimes you get comments back and, it's your work, you're close to it and it can feel, like, oh my goodness, there's so many things they want me to change. So I always recommend read through them, take a couple days to digest it, and then, come back to it and say, okay, how am I gonna plan this? And I, respond to every comment and try to be very deferential in a way, say, thank them, for the comments that they're giving you, because they are taking a time, right? Their time to be able to provide feedback on your piece. And if, you're going to tell them how you addressed it, if you agree with that comment. If you don't agree, you really need to tell them why. Again, think about it as an intellectual exchange. That's what it is, right? And so to point out, and I think the great example of that is this question of increasing the policy engagement in our work. And so I absolutely agreed. Yes, that policy engagement is important. So we can increase that engagement in the introduction and conclusion, but there's trade-offs here, right? And so to point it out in a very different, I'm concerned that if I were to address this, this comment in a longer fashion or integrate it throughout the piece, that it would be at the detriment of the original research that we are trying to present, right? And so really, try to explain why you've made the choices that you've made, right? And often, even if that reviewer has a different view than you about what's important, as long as you are able to defend your work in a polite way, I think often, they'll see evidence. You want to show that you've actually taken into consideration and thought about their comments, even if you don't agree with it, right? And that's what intellectual exchange is all about. And it makes your work stronger. Yeah.
And which collaboration tools did you use? Google Drive or?
Yeah, so what we used Google Drive a lot. Yeah, we used Google Drive a lot. And then we had kind of Zoom meetings as well. Is that right, Patrick?
Yes, that's correct. We had Google Drive, also a lot of calls on either Zoom or Google. So that was it.
Yeah, it was virtual. I mean, and we tried to, I guess, limit our Zoom calls for time's sake, where we say, okay, let's meet every time we get reviewer comments back and we'll talk through and see if we're on the same page about it and what we need to do and come up with this kind of plan of attack for addressing it. And then we would share it in terms of using Google Drive, because that allows us to, Google's Drive is so nice because it allows everyone to be working in the same document.
Yeah, this is the, go ahead, Patrick.
I was just going to add on the previous comment that the previous point on to what extent do you sort of disagree respectively, because at the end of the day, it's your study, you know what you wanted, and you could take advice here and there, but and this also applies to the people who are currently studying as a student, like master or PhD level. Sometimes you receive this feedback from your professor and you feel like when you follow this one, you're going to change your topic. So it's really up to you. As long as it's an intellectual exchange, as Alesha said, then they should see the sense in you sticking to what you originally did. Of course, you could also just tweak one or two things, but there are things like at some point, I think during the last round of review that we did, revision, I think one of the reviewer was sort of like, if we followed what he was suggesting, then we would have done a completely different paper and it will become something on like social protection in Africa, but not social protection in Kenya, particularly on registration. So it's just a tricky balance that you need to observe.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I see we've gone a little over the hour and there's still more participants coming in and more questions, which just says to the interest on this topic. And also thank you so much for sharing your process with us and the content of your work. There's so many more questions and I'm not sure how to address this. If you still have a few more minutes, maybe you can give us some quick closing remarks or address some of those.
Yeah, I think I'm reading through. We didn't have anyone professionally proofread the paper before final submission, which is a question that Aurelia had. I think it's a excellent question. I think, if you have funding to do so, it can be really useful. Also, I know colleagues that use it, for example, to cut down the number of words, which can be a really difficult thing. So, I think that becomes a question of funding, which we just didn't have. Louisa also asked us how we stay motivated during the review process. I must say, after 2 years, I was expecting us to get a reject potentially from World Development after this. You never know, right? And so I was already compiling the list of the next journal that we might submit to, well recognizing that it was a stronger paper than we started with, absolutely. So that review process was valuable, and I'm so glad it did get accepted at World Development. But I do think it's important to note that rejections are normal, right? Anyone who's published is going to have just as many, if not more, rejections from journals, than acceptances. And so it can be tough and it can be discouraging, but I think the key thing is to take into account the comments that you think are going to strengthen your paper, right? And as Patrick said, there's always going to be people who don't agree with you on how you want, the end product to be. There's people who are always going to challenge you. That's part of, the intellectual exchange. That's part of, being in academia. That's part of publishing, and that's fine. You just need to kind of learn how to defend and also, stay true to your work at the same time. And Patrick, do you want to jump in at any?
Well, just a second on how we stayed motivated. It was really, like, for me personally, I really had to push, because like this was going to be my first article to be published in an academic journal. So that motivated me, and having Alesha with us, who had, I think, published before that, was useful. And it was also motivating having her in the team, because I really wanted to get published. So this was one of the key motivations for us, for me specifically. And yeah, that's what I can say on that.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. So if you still have more questions, I see a lot of comments of thank you, keep it up, congratulations, very inspiring. If you still have any outstanding or unanswered question, feel free to continue this discussion. We do have a WhatsApp group where we are all convened as the Africana Journal Club program of AIDA Africa. And if you're a guest today and you'd like to join us, please do so by contacting us. Our website is aidaafricaltd.com, and please fill the webinar feedback form. Your feedback is very valuable to us. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you to our presenters for quite an amazing journey you had there and great sharing. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wangari, and thank you everyone for your comments and questions.
Okay, so I'll now declare this meeting closed, and feel free